Hi, welcome to Infusion Health, the podcast. I'm comedian Chris Patrick, a.k.a. Self-Proclaimed Power Man. And I'm here with my co-host and significant other, Rach.
Hey, guys.
And today we got I've been waiting and I've been anticipating. I've done a lot of research on this subject. We're talking about the Civil War. Now, if you know, the Civil War was one of our most bloodiest wars here on American soil. It had family against family. It had brother against brother. Now, what are we doing talking about the Civil War? One of the things is I love history. I love reading about history, especially African-American history. But we're not talking about African-American history. We're talking about some of the medical advancements that were made due to the Civil War. And a lot of stuff you're gonna hear. It's gonna be a little graphic. It's gonna be a little gruesome, but because of it, we've been able to use and we've been able to acquire some of the skills and stuff that were made and brought forth by the Civil War. And we got somebody here on our show, our guest today. Again, he's family. He's my father-in-law, the one and only Gary Cass. Gary, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much.
Now, before we get started, you served in the Army, Navy.
I was 20 years between the Army and the Army National Guard.
Okay, so he's a veteran, and you've read about, it's not just this war, but you've also read about a lot of other wars and stuff like that. You like reading about the conflicts and stuff like that. Am I right?
Well, I've done a great deal of research in anything to do with military history.
Okay.
And I've also interviewed a lot of military combat veterans.
Okay. And not only that, but also I forgot to mention, you were actually Rachel's dad.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
You know me very well.
So let's okay. Now the Civil War. Okay. Now what I was taught was that the North didn't want slavery. The South didn't want slavery, and we're just going to get into this real general. Then we're going to get into the medical issues. But that is all false. What was wrong was that the country was actually, and correct me if I'm wrong, the country was actually divided economically because the South was making a lot of money, and of course they were making a lot of money because they had free labor, and Lincoln was like, you have to buy these parts and stuff like that for like cotton gin and all that to help these guys out, to help equal out the wealth. And what happened was he had a bunch of talks with the South, and then the South was like, hey, you know what, we're done talking to you. We're going to rescind. And Lincoln's like, you can't do that, and which brought on the Civil War. Now, African Americans, as you know, were slaves then, and they left to fight because, hey, this is our chance at freedom. And then they said, okay, well, hey, the slave owners were like, hey, you guys come back to your owners, no harm, no foul. And the next day, not one slave returned, and they said, no, we're here to fight. We're going to fight, which brought in the Civil War. I think was it 1863 or 1864?
Civil War started in 1861.
1861.
Yeah, and while what you say about the socioeconomic differences between the two sectors, it's important to realize that the South was primarily an agrarian, slave-based economy with little capital.
Mm-hmm.
The North, on the other hand, had all the capital, 9/10 of the railroads, 89% of the industrial capacity, and twice the population. The North had about 18 to 19 million people. The South had 5.5 million free men and 3.5 million slaves.
Okay, so you're talking agrarian. The South was mostly an agricultural. So
yes,
and they were growing corn, cotton.
Well, primarily cotton.
Cotton.
They did have some tobacco and other crops, but a lot of the foodstuffs were raised in other parts of the country. Although they did have a fair amount, but they were making so much money on cotton that they grew little else.
And the cotton was used, of course, for clothes and for other things.
Right.
So you and then you said,
during the war, it was used for military outfits.
Well, it was, but the North quickly fell away from that. They started using wool.
Yeah.
They started using what?
wool.
Wool. Okay. Wool from sheeps.
Right. And a lot of the economy of cotton dried up during the war because a lot of it was imported overseas, and the North quickly imposed an embargo, so they couldn't get their cotton to the markets.
And also too, so you're saying that, okay, now we had the South was an agrarian, and then you said the North had the railroads and all, but so what in turn brought about the Civil War?
Well, I think
Was it the economic difference, or?
well, it was primarily based on the political aspects of the war. The South had begun to lose their pull in Washington, and they'd actually begin, because they didn't have the population, the only real sway they had was in the Senate, which 2 senators from each state, wherein the representatives are picked on the basis of population. So for many years there was a balance between the South and the North in terms of senators and even presidents. But the South will quickly tell you it was a conflict brought on by states' rights, which is partially true. But the primary reason was because the South was not ready to give up their slave-based economy.
And of course, slave-based economy. And when you look at it, I'm not sure the math in today's dollars, but when you farm a crop and you take that crop to market, you're making a lot of money, and you don't have to pay. You're paying zero labor, so all that money is pure profit.
Yes.
Now, and like I said, I wouldn't know how much that was in today's dollars, but yeah, you're making a lot of money because you don't have to pay that 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week. You don't have to pay that money, so all that money it goes into your pocket.
Well, let me make a pun out of this. The South was enslaved to slavery. Slavery was not free. The slaves had become very, very expensive.
Yeah.
And they had become so dependent on that style of living that they couldn't envision themselves in any other role. So they went to war over it.
Sure.
So they went to war over it, but when did didn't they want to rescind? The South wanted to rescind.
Well, the South wanted to assure that there would never be any legislation brought against slavery, and the abolition movement in the North, as well as the primary thoughts of the North were, no, that's not something we're going to guarantee to you.
So basically what you're saying is they became so accustomed and so accountable on that slavery-based living that was their way of life.
It was their way of life, yes.
So to lose that was their bread and butter, basically.
So they envisioned, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would have brought wealth down.
Well, in the end, they did give up their wealth.
Sure.
They lost it in the war. Because they were unwilling to compromise on any other kind of issues. On the obverse, the North was more than willing to compromise on slavery for many, many years.
Sure.
The South brought it upon themselves. I think the North was looking at gradual emancipation, whereas the South was looking for guarantees that slavery would continue forever.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like I said, like we've talked about before, is like when you have the free labor and things were changing. And this has always been on my mind, because you started to have things like the cotton gin, and with the cotton gin, that took away. You didn't need as many slaves to process the cotton. So it's always been, and I call this the $1 million question: had we not had the Civil War, would the Industrial Revolution would slavery kind of fall at the wayside? Would it just equaled out? And I'm not sure I have the answer to that question.
Well, I think one of the realizations that the South was unwilling to recognize at the time there was other ways that an industrial revolution could have took place, but it would have involved the gradual emancipation of most, if not all, of the slaves,
Sure.
and they were unwilling to consider that.
Right.
And then they started to they were going to rescind from the union. Now, when we talk about rescind from the union, we're talking like states like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Florida, Georgia, Alabama.
Well, there was, the deep South states: South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi.
What about Florida?
And Florida. Even as far as Texas, although Texas had quite a mixed economy. And then there was the border states, Kentucky, Tennessee. They, in fact, kept slavery during the war, but they remained loyal to the Union in some degree. Actually, in some of the border states, they mobilized regiments to both the Union and the Confederacy.
Okay, so then let's move ahead. So now the South wants to rescind. Lincoln's like, no, you can't do that. We end up getting the Civil War. Now, from some of the research I had, there was only going to be like one battle, and from some of the stuff I saw, is like people brought their picnic baskets and all that to watch this battle, and this was going to be like the battle to say, okay, this is what's going on. But no, that was the first battle that went into the war.
Well, I think you have to look at not only the economies, but the focus of the North and South at the time. Indeed, you're talking about First Manassas, where people did go out. They thought this was going to be the culmination of the war, when in fact it was just the beginning. Many things weren't realized: the number of casualties, the number of fatalities, the longevity of the conflict. But worse than that, neither side had any martial history of recent history. Even some of the earlier wars in the United States were rather small affairs. For example, the Mexican War and the Wars of Revolution, 1812, and the War of Independence. They didn't realize total war. They didn't realize what total war was about. Yet both sides had obligated themselves to a total war. So no, it was not going to. They were not ready for what finally came out, and that's why the medicine in the Civil War became so devastating.
Sure.
Okay, then let's for later on in conversation, just so people can know this, Lincoln was the first Republican president, but a lot of people don't know this. Lincoln was a Republican. His vice president was a Democrat. Now, we got the war, and they had the first general, and then Grant came and took over as general of the North. And Grant was like, okay, instead of trying to take territory, let's attack his armies. And Gary, can you go a little bit further into that?
Well, I think those lessons were learned during the war. Yes, indeed, there was a focus on capture of territory. The first medical or military concept of the war was called the Anaconda Plan, where they were going to strangle the South, cut off all its ports. And indeed, that was a legitimate strategy. But in order to in order to annihilate an enemy, to kill an enemy off, you have to close with him and have battle with him. And neither side recognized that's what was going to happen.
So who was the first general, and then he you told me he didn't get demoted, but then Grant came in and took over. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think the recognition is that Lincoln was the greatest general of the war, except he wasn't a general. He very quickly realized, how horrid the Civil War was going to be and what was going to be involved. None of the generals, because of their training, were prepared for this. They knew how to perhaps lead a battalion or a company, but in the Civil War, where they were leading divisions, regiments, and even corps and armies, and none of them had that background. And they weren't particularly ready to accept casualties. Grant, I think, his greatest contribution is not so much his quest to close with the armies as much as it is to realize that in closing with the enemy, you were going to have casualties.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And he quickly realized, again, even on the basis of population, the South could not absorb as much casualties as the North could.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, medical advancements were very poor.
Well, yeah.
So now we're getting into, okay, the war is happening. You got the North against the South, and then we're starting to get casualties. So now we're getting into the medical advancements as far as the conditions they had and the stuff they had to operate. And a lot of people are like, okay, we got to do this to them. Let's amputate. And Gary's going to go a little bit more into that.
Well, I think the first realization is at the beginning of the Civil War, and even, in fact, well after the Civil War, there was no understanding of the role bacteria, viruses, and vector plays in mortality and morbidity.
Mm-hmm.
The casualties of the Civil War are quite interesting. And casualties are people that are injured, or total of people that are injured and killed. Mortality is the number of people that were killed. During the Civil War, over 204,000 people died from injuries. Mm-hmm. Now, that includes both the North and South, because before and after the war, we were Americans. They were Americans before, and they were after. On the other hand, over 400,000 died from diseases. Mm-hmm. And this goes into the misunderstanding of diseases.
Well, what diseases? What diseases are we talking about? Is malaria?
Just about anything you can imagine: smallpox, malaria, tetanus, typhoid.
Or even on the table when they're doing amputations, right? There wasn't a common cleaning understanding of cleanliness.
And that's the second thing that was not understood. They didn't understand bacteria, so they didn't know how to eliminate it. They didn't know how to sanitize the hospital. They didn't know how to sanitize the operating field. They did not know how to keep the soldiers safe from, ticks and rats and things of that nature. There's well-documented stories of doctors who did amputations, moved from one patient to the other, used the same instruments over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Just like for our listeners, just like me and you talked about on our my YouTube channel yesterday.
Yeah, we'll see. Okay, now what's going on is we have the war. People are getting wounded in the battlefield. They're being taken to the medical tents, and the tents were open, and they didn't have running water. They didn't have clean water, and like Gary was saying, is that they would amputate one person and then go over and use that same knife without cleaning all that and amputate another. But also too, we have a war. We have this going on, and we got doctors are there that aren't properly trained in this, and they're kind of learning it as they're going. And this is some of the stuff that they came across. Am I?
Well, again, the doctors weren't properly trained because there was no understanding of what they were supposed to be training. No understanding of sanitation or vectors or bacteria, viruses, immunizations, which is kind of a critical issue.
Right. Yes.
So what happened is that, people died from measles and typhoid, which are now vaccinated diseases. They died from tuberculosis, which is now a vaccinated disease. Mm-hmm. And again, there are 400,000 died from diseases. The battle casualties in and of themselves were pretty horrible.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is that the instruments of war had become so much more terrible.
Right.
prior to the Civil War, they had what they called the Napoleonic concept of war.
Napoleon, of course, tried to invade France. Was it?
Well, he was a Frenchman. He tried to invade most of continental Europe.
Yeah.
And for the most part, succeeded until he got to Russia.
Yeah, till he got to Russia. But
what I'm trying to point out is the tactic was to mass huge amount of troops and assault the enemy with maybe one or two volleys fired. But the weapons weren't accurate enough at the time. Mm-hmm. So they would close and stab them with bayonets and swords and that type of thing. During the Civil War, edged swords were less than 1% of the injuries. So 99% of the injuries came from weaponry.
Okay.
The cannons, particularly the musket, rifled musket was a particular cause of great casualty.
Okay, so somebody gets shot or gets hurt on the battlefield. They take them to the medical tent. And they look at them and it's like,
not exactly takes them to the medical tent, because as you were talking about with me on the YouTube channel, there wasn't a paramedic.
There was no paramedics at the time. There was, in fact, no method of removing soldiers from the battlefield. Mm-hmm. A lot of times they'd come along 3-4 days later and they'd have two wagons, one for the dead and one for the wounded.
Yeah. And so you're saying, okay, person's on the battlefield, he gets shot, he's laying there for 3 or 4 days before they're able to get him to get medical attention, and within this 3 or 4 days.
Well, one of the things you talked about is what developed during the war. Mm-hmm. What remedies developed during the war. At the beginning of the war, there was no nurses.
Yeah.
There was no ambulances.
Yeah.
By the end of the war, there was both.
Yeah.
They had seen the need for both. In fact, they even started to develop rudimentary antiseptic procedures.
And with that said, one of the ladies there who was a nurse, she ended up starting the Red Cross, which is still today.
Clara Barton.
Yeah. Clara Barton. Yeah.
But there's, like I said, before the Civil War, there was no career for nurses. Mm-hmm. Part of why they're developed is because nurses or women have and remain the primary caregivers of our society. Mm-hmm. So to introduce them into the medical or into the military got a lot of pushback at first.
Yeah.
But then they found out people needed that. They needed care. Mm-hmm. They needed to be removed from the battlefield. They needed to be sanitized. They needed to be cared for.
Mm-hmm.
And they were doing this mainly on the south side than the north at first, right?
I think both sides realized it together. One of the advantages the South had, they had none of the assets.
Okay.
So they had to use the assets they had more judiciously. Mm-hmm. And their Surgeon General on the southern side was a guy named Samuel Moore. He was a very, very forward-looking man who saw some of these things and saw how the South didn't have the advantages and how they could most carefully use the assets that they did. So they used nurses more. They developed medications more properly affixed to what was needed by the soldiers.
Well, before we had, and correct me if I'm wrong again, before we had the nurses then, before we had the female nurses, they were guys that were like what would you say the
drunks,
and stuff.
The guys that couldn't do their job.
Yeah,
the drunks, the idiots. They were detailed to provide care for the soldiers. Well, that was almost worse than nothing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So when nurses came in and both sides realized that the care of the soldiers was the only way to preserve their lives, and preservation of life is a good way to win a battle.
Yeah. Well, that was also a thing too, is because a lot from some of the research I was doing before we did this podcast was that some of these guys were like fresh out of medical school, and a lot of like we talked before, a lot of them weren't properly trained, and there was like, okay, his bone is shattered. let's amputate,
Well, again, I think there's a little story that goes to that. As I said, the most deadly weapon on the battlefield was a rifled musket. It shot what's called a mini ball. A mini ball.
Yeah, which was named after the guy who
invented it.
Yeah.
Charles Minnie.
Charles Minnie, yeah.
It expanded as it was fired. It was like a thimble, and it expanded into the rifle grooves of the barrel and became more accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing about the mini ball, it imparted a tremendous amount of energy to the injury.
Mm-hmm.
So you might get hit in the arm, and they'd have to amputate your whole arm. You might get hit below the knee, and they'd have to amputate the whole thing because the energy imparted to the wound was just tremendous.
And just so our listeners know, these were not your traditional guns where you just go, fire. You had to pack the gunpowder in, you had to pack the ball in, you had to pack.
At the beginning of the Civil War, there was no such thing as a breech loading rifle.
Mm-hmm.
Everything had to be loaded through the barrel. That, for the most part, for most of the troops in the war, did not change.
And it was a one shot, right? You loaded it, you shot it, then you had to load it again.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think, and I'm not sure, and I'm referring back to the movie Glory. Matthew Broderick, Denzel Washington. I think they said they got it up to a speed to where they could do it. They could fire off 4 shots a minute, and we're talking not just boom, 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 4 shots a minute. We're talking shoot, load, shoot, boom.
Yeah, and there was a lot of development of the weaponry during the war, mm-hmm. and some of it did come into effect. But the reality is that, for the most part, the primary weapon was a rifled musket.
Rifled muskets that shot the mini balls.
That shot mini balls.
That shot mini balls. And like we said before, you had to self-load this thing after every shot.
Yes.
And then when the ball came into you, it shattered bones. It did a lot of damage once it hit you.
Right. And then you mentioned something about amputations. Amputations became an almost necessary thing,
mm-hmm.
Sure.
Because of the damage compared to modern shot.
Right.
Yeah.
The energy imparted to the wound was such that it almost had to be amputated.
Yeah.
Maybe with modern medicine they could have saved the limb or parts of the limb,
mm-hmm.
but not with the medicine they had at the time.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong in this visual. It's like, okay, I'm on the battlefield. I pack my gun. I shoot. Somebody's coming at me. I pack it again, shoot again, and he's coming at me. Okay, I don't got time to pack it, so I'm going to have to use my bayonet that's on the back of my rifle and
Front of your rifle.
in the front of my rifle, yeah, in the front of my rifle, and like stab this guy or whatever, because he's coming at me.
Well, the analogy is correct, but the reality is that a lot of these injuries occurred well before
Right.
Mm-hmm.
you got close enough to see the guy's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew Jackson famously said in the War of 1812, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes."
Right.
No such rules existed in the Civil War. There was a lot. In fact, the majority of casualties occurred between 75 to 100 yards or greater than that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even snipers on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why the edge weapons didn't play much of a role. All these casualties occurred well before the units had a chance to close on the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
for myself, I would understand that there was medical advancements for understanding that you would need a paramedic team, you would need nursing, you would need cleanliness, but also for weapons, there was advancements also there.
Yeah, and that was the primary reason for the huge number of casualties from injuries. And as I spelled out earlier, the number of casualties from diseases was quite another matter.
Yep.
Because of the inability to recognize bacterias, viruses, and vectors.
Okay. Well, Gary, it was a pleasure having you on the show. We're definitely going to do, I'll ask Rach.
Well, we got the YouTube channel. We did it with Dad also, so they can definitely jump on there, and I'll have the link with this. So we've got even more education with Dad on that. So they've got tons of education with Dad on this.
And then I'd like to ask Gary. Gary, if anybody would like to know more about, and I know there's a ton of books out there. What books would you recommend people reading if they want to read more about this, about the Civil War in general, or the medical advancements made during the Civil War?
There's a couple of books. One is, and I don't remember the exact titles nor the authors, but one is Medicine in Blue, and the other was Medicine in Gray, and it helps spell out some of these, some of the things that occurred during that. But even as our earlier conversation, even an understanding of the lethality of the battlefield is important to realize. I didn't make this stuff up. I did a lot of research, and one of the guys that did it is a doctor in Marshall, Minnesota. His name is Lloyd Peterson. He did his doctoral thesis on medicine in the Civil War. So there's a lot of aspects to it, but even a cursory reading of Civil War battles will quickly determine, or show you, where this is headed.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And and like I said, it was one of our most bloodiest battles on American soil, and it was sad to see that that you had the two things, and learn a lot about it, because growing up in school in the 70s, the history class was like always fault because of slavery. It wasn't just slavery that started the Civil War. There was lots of things that started the Civil War. I would say the biggest thing was the economical differences between the two.
Absolutely.
Gary, it was a pleasure having you on the show. I love talking history. I love this. I mean, we only got a half-hour podcast. I could talk for 6 hours. Rachel would probably be sleeping by then. But thanks a lot.
I love history too.
Thanks a lot for coming on the show, and I'll let Rachel close us out.
All right. History is born on lines of hate. On here, we're trying to build lines of love and trying to make you guys your best advocate. I want to thank my father, Gary, for joining us. And if you appreciate what you heard, please subscribe and tell others. Chris, close us out.
Thanks a lot, and take it easy.